Elliot, I'm just curious, from a broadcast perspective, have things been just as busy during COVID for you as they were pre-COVID?
I think that really depends on who you're working for. So at the moment, the only broadcaster I'm working with is CNN on a freelance basis. They have a full-time correspondent. So it's really when he is away or off for whatever reason, or when there's a really big story, like we might have new elections, for example, that I'll be drafted in. So I know that I will, all being well, be there quite a bit over the next few weeks. And as you can imagine, for a US facing network, it's kind of been a two-story show over the last few months. And that obviously is the US elections, Donald Trump and coronavirus. I did do a few reports here on COVID in Israel. It was, in the beginning, one of the best. And then it went from hero to zero by becoming one of the worst on a per capita basis.
That's a headline statement, right? Hero to zero. Everybody's writing down.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Use it for another story. Eric, I can tell, is already cranking out using that.
And now we look like we might be going into if not a third lockdown, they're talking about a kind of the lights going out over Hanukkah for having some kind of curfew. So, which is really annoying for me because, and it will last until the new year. And my birthday being Christmas Day makes it extra worrisome that I might not be able to, go out and eat as many donuts as I like.
My wife also shares your birthday. So,
happy birthday, Mrs. Basher.
The historic significance. So we're about 5 minutes out, and also Idan has let me know that people are joining the call. He's manually placing them on mute. We also have Levy now on screen, and he's looking as handsome as ever. I might mention that, speaking of birthdays, last week was Levy's birthday, and happy 30th, Levy. It's wonderful to see you getting older and older as you get younger and younger. It's fantastic.
Yeah, my 30th 2 times over. So
right. I don't think so.
Good.
If that were true, by the way, if that were true, we would be not testing your blood for antibodies. We would be testing your blood for youth serum. So, we know it's not 30 times 2.
Good.
By the way, I one of the questions, don't answer this question, I'm going to ask all of you, though, is the journalist bombshell from the past week was Christina Farr's departure, going to the investment side of this. And I'll be curious to get your view on that. Not the right or wrong. I'm not going to tell you the question yet. It's not whether it's good or bad. It's a trend I see in the sector in terms of the increase of investment overall in health innovation and digital health specifically. That's one. And then, one of the trends I see in your book, the shift in the last 5 years from "isn't this cool" to the analysis of is this workable? Is this feasible? What is this fixing? How will this get paid? And I think that all of you have gone and represent sort of the cutting edge of quality reporting, which is, we're not writing about this because we think it's nifty. We're writing about this because we think it's So I'm going to ask you a little bit about that as well. And I think our audience, if you're following the superstars of your sector, of which clearly the 4 of you are among the superstars of the sector. I'm curious to see, are we going to be able to keep you in this sector, or are you going to be scooped up by private equity in the next year? And by the way, having been in private equity myself, I can understand the desire of the other side of the table to say, wait a minute, let's get people who really have an expansive knowledge of the category. And I think one of the great pieces, Elise, you wrote recently, was sort of the economics of it, sort of like on and pharmaceutical costs. And so all of you have just this amazing strength in the health economy.
And I want to specifically thank Jonah for wearing a suit and tie. You are clearly the most dapper member of this group.
Well, it's rare that I get an occasion to these days, you know? I was just going to wear the jacket, but then I thought, what the heck? I haven't done that since February.
So I think I'm going to ask the audience to poll me on who's going first with equity. And Jonah, I think you're already dressed.
Right.
There's amusingly the picture that Business Insider has been using for their JP Morgan stories is a picture of a bunch of business people in front of the main hotel where they do JP Morgan, and then I'm the only person in the picture not wearing a suit. So I'm sticking out like a sore thumb right in the middle of the picture because I'm wearing a shirt and a blazer instead. So
I was going to say though that I would not be surprised if we end up returning to San Francisco, and I'm assuming none of us are going to San Francisco next month. If we are, we're there by ourselves. But I think we'll probably get back to San Francisco in 2022. I doubt if any of us are going to be wearing ties, or the equivalent.
People were talking about JP Morgan being dead or dying, last year before the pandemic started. So I wonder if maybe it turns out it won't come back or it'll stay virtual. But
I don't know about all of you, and since we know Levy's going to kick off in a moment, but I actually have been going less inside, even though I have the badge, going less inside JP Morgan, the Drake, because I see most of that stuff through the course of the year at the quarterly conference calls and the annual meetings. I'm actually going to other meetings like Startup Health and meetings like that. I see a lot of I'm going to the peripheral meetings. I'm finding I'm getting a lot more information outside in a cafe and bumping into people I want to speak to than sitting in large or small rooms in the fire trap known as JP Morgan and seeing people's PowerPoint presentations that they've labored for weeks over, and I could have had at any time. So I don't know about you. I go to San Francisco not for Morgan. I've could have taken JP Morgan and verbed it. When I say I'm going to JP Morgan, I mean I'm going to JP Morgan. Yeah.
That's probably one of the trends we will be talking about is the evolution of the way that companies in the health and business space are communicating externally. We have an amazing group of people to address that, not only sort of the do's and don'ts of sort of cultivating and nurturing relationships with journalists, but maybe we'll have some time in the next 60 minutes, Gil, to sort of ask everyone to do their Karnak the Great and look into their crystal balls for some of the healthcare trends and business trends that they're looking forward to for 2021. Very good group. Eric Wickland from Maine, but also from mHealth Intelligence, yes. Elise Reuter from Denver and Med City News. That's Elise. Jonah Comstock is pretending to not be the person pictured there. He's incognito with a beard and fancy clothing. Elliot Gatkan, who is joining us from Tel Aviv, of all places. And Gil Bash will be our moderator. We're also very fortunate to be having another event coming up on December 17th about health tech innovation in Asia. And Gil will be moderating that one as well. So we're really grateful for the valuable time and expertise of our panel and our moderator. There's more than 200 folks RSVP'd for this. So clearly, I think we've touched on a real interest. We've scratched a real itch. Gil, if you would like to take it away from here, I just want to sit back and listen.
Thank you so much. And actually, let me just spend a second or two acknowledging you. Levi Shapiro is really the, I wanted to say the unofficial ambassador of health innovation and health technology and digital health. But I think by the number of people who have signed this particular panel, our panelists, all esteemed journalists of renown, I think we acknowledge that you are the official ambassador of health technology. Levi is also the founder and curator of mHealth Israel. He's traveling the world on the behalf of innovators, advocating for them. You can find Levi, whether it's in Europe, in Germany, in England, in France, in Singapore, in China, Japan. You speak Japanese, don't you, correct? He's on mute, but he's nodding like, yes, probably in Japanese. And obviously, United States. Correct? Japanese as well, Levi?
Japanese, yes. Number 2 med tech market in the world, folks, but that's another conversation for December 17th. But thank you for the kind words.
That's well earned, Levi. So I'm going to jump right into this. We have a little less than an hour together. And with our panelists, we were just talking about something that many of you would be thinking about, whether you were presenting at JP Morgan. I know many of you are not presenting at JP Morgan, but you go to JP Morgan in order to meet with colleagues, to meet with potential investors, to meet with potential partners. So we were just talking a few moments ago about the importance of JP Morgan. And I just want to kick off with Jonah. And Elise, listen closely to this question because I'm going to turn to you as well. Jonah, from the years, is JP Morgan as important to our community as a specific meeting, or has it really shifted away from JP Morgan to the environment, to what I'll call the Woodstock, the Burning Man of innovation and life sciences? What is it?
I will confess that I've never been able to get a dang ticket to JP Morgan itself, but I've
You gotta hang with me, friend. Well, I'll get you in next time, okay?
And all I do is the satellite stuff. You mentioned the Startup Health event, but also you just take a lot of meetings. I mean, it's a really good opportunity. I think we're all digital journalists. We're all, at this point, basically digital native journalists. We know that a lot of our interviewing is going to happen over the phone or even over email. It's a really incredible opportunity to get to go once a year and have sit down in-person meetings and put faces with names. And, you might not get a scoop there, but you might build a connection that gets you a scoop later on. So for me, that's, it's about the industry kind of coming together in person, which is of course the irony now is that that's the one thing you can't do in a virtual event. So it'll be very interesting to see how they handle the virtual version in January.
No, really.
But yeah, I think it's in their minds, and I think that is something that's going to need to exist. And JP Morgan has been the convener of that, but because they, I don't want to say they got lucky, but they, they've been doing it for a long enough time and they have the cachet. So whether it's JP Morgan or not, we're always, I think, going to want to have that meeting of minds. And
now hold on to that for a second, Jonah, because I'm going to circle back to you on meetings. And Elise, you're like, what's your perspective on JP Morgan for you? I mean, is it really JP Morgan that you're going for? Or is it like the experience, the environment?
I mean, personally, for me, a very similar story last year. I think I spent more time just meeting people one-on-one or going to the Startup Health conference, which I found really valuable. So for me, it's kind of more about the other kind of events or panels that are going on around it, and also just the opportunity to have FaceTime with people, because it's the one time where everyone's kind of in the same place and you can see people who live in different states. So I think it's really valuable to be able to meet people in person.
So you've enjoyed that personal contact. I want to flip a little bit for a second behind the lens and ask Elliot something for a moment. No, Elliot, you're working on big drill down stories that deal with finance, tech, politics, all of this. And now historically, as we've grown up in all industries of communication, broadcast followed print. And now when I look at Jonah and Eric and Elise, and I realize print, like print is no more. I mean, these are massive digital reporters, online reporters, they're covering like this. When you're looking at prepping for a broadcast story, a breaking broadcast story, let's take COVID in Israel, which has been a hot digital tech market. What's the prep process that goes on when you're no longer really relying on the front page of the New York Times? You've got to kind of drive the story yourself.
I think it depends on what the story is and what the situation is. And I'll just give you a recent example, which is kind of emblematic of what's going on these days. And this was not the COVID crisis, but actually when Israel announced the normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates and then subsequently Bahrain. And it came, as a bolt from the blue. I was at home and I was on duty for CNN. And they told me, okay, they're going to come to you in 5 minutes on the phone. So okay, fine. So I quickly, got up to speed on what the story was and what the announcement had been. And then the presenter from CNN came to me, and literally the second she came to me, my dog starts barking blue murder, and I literally can hardly hear the presenter. I'm trying to think, I'm trying to speak, I'm trying to unplug my laptop, I'm trying to barricade myself in my bedroom. And at the end of the conversation, which didn't go that badly, the presenter said, I see the deal's got the canine seal of approval. And so, this is what we're dealing with right now, because I do have a setup to broadcast, for TV, if you like, from my living room. But, such was the suddenness of this news that you obviously only have a few moments to prepare. Then after that, I had about 10 minutes to prepare. So, and because I hadn't been on air that day, I was in my home. So I quickly, shaved, showered, changed, set up the camera, set up the lighting, got my son to take my dog for a walk, and then got in front of the camera, within 10 minutes, which, is not something, journalists are necessarily trained to do or I've ever had to do in the past. Yes, I've had to deal with breaking news without any preparation, and you're expected to have an understanding of the context and the background of that story so that you can add some value rather than just reading off a piece of paper or a newswire or something. But I think, when you are preparing...
I've never thought of a co-host as being a dog, but obviously you're facing that in the COVID-19 environment. Very well done, by the way. I know that you've moved out of your house to a special studio for this webinar, and we thank you. We're just sorry that we don't have a chance to meet your dog. I think everybody, all 200
She's
people,
very cute.
Probably pet lovers. So let me just ask Eric a question. Eric, you have dealt recently with this whole concept of the explosion of telehealth. You've written a number of pieces, as a matter of fact, on telehealth. And, I just wanted to get your experience, because telehealth has always existed. COVID kind of put the gas pedal on it. But I want to ask you a touchy question based on your writing. And that we know why telehealth is exploding right now, right? People are frightened of going to their doctor. They're frightened of going to facilities. They're frightened of being, in a situation where they can't social distance from other people. So a little bit of predictive. I want to ask you a two-part question. I know it's going to be a difficult one, so get ready for this. One, how much has the health system, the fragmentation of the health system and economics, in other words, a doctor saying, hey, how am I going to get reimbursed for seeing my patients on video? How has that limited telehealth in the past? That's one. And two, in a post-COVID-19 environment, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see normalization? In other words, telehealth, the boom of telehealth sort of slip back, and a return to sort of bad behaviors of the system of like sit in a waiting room for an hour to see your doctor? What's your take on this?
We're going to see what everybody likes to call the new normal. Yes, the pandemic just rapidly increased the use of telehealth, because not only were patients not wanting to see their doctors, hospitals and health systems wanted to keep those patients away from their locations so that they could treat COVID patients. This in turn created a huge groundswell of support for these telehealth services, where you could treat people in their homes, or you could treat people in other locations rather than the hospital, the doctor's office, or so on and so forth. Now, yes, reimbursement is one of the biggest barriers to advancement. Doctors want to get reimbursed. They want to get paid for using these new services. The problem is right now we don't know how to measure the value of these new services. Is a telehealth visit of the same value as an in-person visit? And until the payers, Medicare, private payers, figure out how much they want to pay a doctor for a virtual visit as compared to an in-person visit, we're going to have this little back and forth right now. Doctors, of course, would like to get paid more or paid the same value for an in-person visit as a virtual visit. A lot of studies, the basis for telehealth is that it is more convenient, could be more effective even than an in-person visit, should it be the same value. And that's one of the barriers. What we're going to see going forward now is we're going to see this little back and forth. I mean, we've gone all virtual for a while. We'll probably go all virtual again in a little while. And then as we gradually move back, we're going to find a balance between the services that need to be done in person and these services that are coming up that can be done virtually, either with an audiovisual platform or even a basic phone call. We're going to find this part where patients are comfortable using this technology. And right now, some of them are, some of them aren't. Same with doctors. Some are comfortable, some of them aren't. They've got to get used to this, and we've got to find some way of making it as easy as possible for both sides to use the technology.
So I'm going to ask you the second part of the question. Is the obstacle to telehealth really ease of use or economic incentive? And you can just sort of I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to put you on the spot. I'm the moderator. So, I'm going to ask you the deadly either or question. Is it economics? Is it convenience?
Reimbursement would be the top barrier to doctors using telehealth. Ease of use would be the biggest barrier to patients using telehealth.
Yeah. That's, by the way, very insightful. And I hope all our listeners sort of write down exactly what you said, because I don't know if innovators sometimes think through the economics of the health system. By the way, all of you as reporters are doing that very clearly. You're tying the economics to this. I want to switch over to Jonah for a second. Jonah, you wrote a fascinating piece recently, a little different than what people would expect. You were writing about Novartis. You were writing about, if I remember correctly, Amazon and Microsoft all sort of coming together on a form of alliance, and in this concept of digital health and digital therapeutics. And historically, we always thought of like Novartis or Merck. I mean, their obsession with either biologics or small molecule tablets, pills, right? That's how they made their money. Pills or complex recombinant therapies. Digital therapeutics, combinations, collaborations with Microsoft. What's that all about? A. B, where is it going? And how does it impact the health innovation industry? Take any one of those.
Pharma has always been simultaneously one of the most innovative groups in the healthcare ecosystem and also one of the most risk averse. Which is down to how they're regulated, among other things. But having covered sort of what we used to call the mobile health space, and now we call the digital health space, at Moby Health News since 2012, we've always kind of had an eye on pharma, and we've always had the sense that pharma was, about to break into this space as a major player. At first, it was how can you use digital technology, connected technology to support drugs, right? So it was like, here's an app that improves medication adherence by reminding you to take your pills, or here's a connected inhaler that tracks, your asthma attacks and then helps you to understand when they're happening. Those sorts of things that pharma was interested in. Digital therapeutics are kind of a category that's emerged in the last 4 or 5 years, I want to say. That almost takes it another step further and says, what if we didn't need the drug at all? What are the situations where the app itself or a connected device itself can play the role of a therapeutic? And if that's where we're headed, if that's one way that, the medical device industry and the healthcare and connected health and home health industries are headed, pharma doesn't want to get left behind by that. They don't want suddenly for drugs to be, a thing of the past because everyone's using tech. They want to be on the front edge of it and they want to own the tech just as much as they want to own the drugs. So, you've seen all along pharma's having these sort of innovation arms that are working to make sure that they're aware of what's happening. They have a foot dipped in it. They're not going to get left behind. What's happened in the last few years is that at a lot of pharma companies, those arms have become more powerful and more central, or they've been integrated into the business. And there's still a long way to go, right? But pharma companies are still, most of their margin is happening from biologics and drugs, as you say.
Just to push on this for a second. Do you think that a lot of our visitors today, our participants on this webinar, are innovators? They range in size from 5 people working out of an apartment to 100 or so, maybe larger. And I've often wondered, are the people listening into our conversation today, are they the sort of like the research and development lab for Merck, for Novartis, for Microsoft? Are they really plugging away and developing that next wave of digital therapeutics, of behavioral modification vehicles that actually, Merck, Novartis, and Microsoft will swoop in and absorb the system as part of therapeutic categories?
Yeah, I think I'm understanding your question right. Both the big tech companies and the big pharma companies are major acquirers. If you look at the history of M&A in this space and the big deals, very often that's who's snapping up digital health companies. And then we see the company emerge as a product category, a few years later in many cases. They're also, we've seen some of the most kind of commercially successful and prominent, although that comes with a caveat, digital health companies have, some of their major moments have been pharma partnerships. I'm thinking of the Proteus-Otsuka partnership, the Novartis Sandoz pair therapeutics. So it's definitely, it's also a path towards sort of legitimacy and adoption. But the caveat is, of course, that some of those have not ended super well.
Yes. Yes, I won't mention names. As I said, one of my things is not to embarrass that one question, because I want to stay a little bit on the context of economics driving innovation. And Elise, you wrote a piece recently. It's a very astute piece. This is the Amazon piece that you wrote, and on the whole concept of Amazon, its desire to use supply chain management and blow up the whole prescription price aspect, to squeeze the inefficiencies out of the system, and as a result of that, lowering the price. And whether it was you or your headline editor were a little bit contrarian in the piece, where you said, "I don't think so." Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but I think you wrote unlikely to change the whole pricing structure. And Jonah has talked about, on one hand, he just talked about pharma saying, wait a minute, if we don't get into this digital game, drugs may become less important. Amazon is saying maybe we can lower the cost of medicines by improving the supply chain management right to the consumer. You're looking at this from a system standpoint. You're looking at this from an economic standpoint. What's the rigor that goes into your analyses when you're writing a piece like this? You're bringing digital health reporting to a different level now, which is, you and Jonah and Eric and Elliot are bringing in the concept of not just the niftiness of an idea, the economic reality of an idea. Talk to us a little bit about the Amazon piece.
Yeah, I think when you see a big tech company like Amazon or someone of their stature decide that, okay, we're going to finally take this step. I think people kind of expected this to a certain extent. given that they acquired PillPack a couple of years ago. You know, that catches everyone's attention. And I think people kind of wonder, you know, are they going to disrupt pharmacy? Are they going to somehow make prices lower? Because I think everyone wants that, you know, at least everyone from a consumer perspective. But I think it's helpful for me, at least as a journalist, just to bring in outside sources that really know the inner workings of how the whole process of negotiating prices of drugs, working with PBMs, and also even just kind of distribution, what regulations go in getting these medications out to people when you start something like this, because it's really challenging and complicated. So I think what kind of caught my attention about what they were doing was the idea that you could compare the price of a drug, both whether you were having the copay, having it covered by your insurance and paying the copay, or whether you wanted to approach that as a cash pay patient and see which one was cheaper. I did really like that. But
it's a great piece, by the way. Congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. It was fun to write.
No, Elliot, you're putting the F in tech, and obviously we're using that word in the most genteel way. That's the name of your podcast program. You know, putting the F in tech. You're talking about finance. Elise has just talked about really looking at the finance in this. How do you make a decision of what you want to cover in your own podcast world? Here you're obviously with CNN, you're news driven, you're dealing with issues of, you know, Israel being shut down around the holiday season now because of another surge in COVID. Those are national news drivers you're brought in to cover. But with putting the F in tech, you're the decision maker there, isn't that right? And how do you make a decision of we need to talk about finance right now on that element of tech.
So the F in Tech podcast, which is available on all podcast platforms, is something
and should be followed by everybody listening today, correct?
Indeed. And the website is f-in-tech.com. And the reason I started this actually during the first lockdown because I didn't have a lot of work at the time. And I figured it was time to kind of, rather than just sit around and bemoan, what was going on in the world, to actually, try and use the gift of time, which I know, we don't kind of realize we lack until we lack it, to do something. And so I've emceed a number of fintech conferences around the world, and I decided to do this. In terms of choosing who to go for, the idea is to kind of, take inspiration from my favorite podcast, which is How I Built This on NPR, and to do it for fintech. There are a lot of fintech podcasts out there, which most of which I should say did not kind of strike me as being particularly interesting, either in the content or the people presenting them. And I just figured I could do better than that. So that's what I did. And it's really just about, getting the stories of interesting people, either for because of them or because of the actual fintechs that they've done. So it's not for fintechs that have just kind of, just, hey, here we are, we've just started and this is our first startup. It's really, either the founder has, an illustrious or already fascinating career behind them, or the company is kind of, quite established, and there's been, a lot of, ins and outs and successes and failures and existential threats and what have you along their journey to becoming established in the company they are. So that's my thought process, and I just try and get the biggest names, the most interesting people that I can.
You do. It's very impressive. I encourage everybody listening today to follow your work. It really is, I think, a model for people to think through their own stories. And I'll be back to you on that in a moment. And speaking about what Elliot just said, Eric, I often find that each of you, in following your coverage and your by the way, I encourage everybody today to go to Twitter and follow. All of our panelists are on Twitter. They're active participants in the community. They're sharing their stories. They're sharing other people's stories. It's very impressive. And I noticed that you're not just sort of ends of one. You have great respect for other people's journalism. And I just wanted to ask you, Eric, if I could. You tend to stay with a storyline for quite some time. It's unusual. A lot of people are like, I wrote about that, I'm moving on from that. you tend to sort of like report on it, take another facet of it, take another facet of it. So for instance, on the telehealth level, you've written about that 5 or 6 times already. And each story is a standalone, unique in itself. Can you share with us a little bit about the importance of not just sort of like one and done, but willing to sort of own segments of the shift in health delivery and why you choose to sort of be expansive in your reporting?
Yeah, I think we're kind of changing the dynamic about how these stories are created. It used to be you get the scoop, you do the story, you're the first one to do it, great, hooray, done, move on to the next thing. With telehealth and with the way journalism is nowadays, it's, the first person getting the stories, the story doesn't end with that first scoop. There's more to it. In telehealth, I deal with, and this is part of my job is that I deal with the providers, the healthcare providers, the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, health systems, clinics, so on and so forth. I'm focused on their angle, their approach to telehealth and telemedicine. So when you see a story that takes a specific angle, I want to look at it from a different angle. I want to look at it, how is telehealth, how is a doctor using telehealth? And from that, how is a doctor in a large multi-hospital health system in Boston using telehealth compared to how is a doctor in a remote location in Montana using telehealth? You look for different angles to try to meet the demands of the audience. And this audience is so varied and there's so many different ways of approaching it that one story doesn't suffice. You gotta look at a number of different angles and write a number of different stories with that angle. And also it's a complex issue. It changes. It develops each day. We're talking about a coronavirus pandemic right now. Telehealth is huge right now, but in time, as I said before, there's going to be a balance. So there's going to be changes in how telehealth is delivered and how telehealth is used. Right now in this pandemic, we have a bunch of emergency measures in place to help telehealth adoption. Eventually, those measures are going to end. Those measures are going to expire when the public health emergency expires. And hospitals, health systems, all the way down to the single practice are going to have to change how they use telehealth. So the story changes again with that. It's following through on a story that doesn't really end.
I'm going to circle back to you, Eric. I have a question. I've had a chance to speak with Amy Abernathy from the Food and Drug Administration. You probably speak to her frequently. She's said many times that these emergency policies will continue after COVID-19. Your comment, your smile, your comment brings a question mark to that. So I'm going to circle back for you because I think one of the things that leads me to respect the 4 of you so much is you don't drink the Kool-Aid. You're prepared to sit back and ask the questions. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask a question first of Jonah, and then it's going to be one of those questions I'm going to ask you each to give a sentence or 2 on, which is you're writing about something that, whether it's my Apple Watch 6 or my new iPhone, or whatever the case might be, we're interested in technology, but we also are blessed to be able to acquire technology. So Jonah, I want to ask you a difficult question. In this day and age, are we doing enough to talk about the health disparities and the digital divide that I think that COVID-19 is actually creating? I look at my own home studio. Elliot mentioned he's at a special studio. He has a special studio.
My living room.
His living room, but he has cameras. He has a dog who helps him do makeup, all of that. And now we're talking about a world of haves and have-nots. Not just in the developing world and the developed world. We're talking about, for those of you who are, whether it's Israel or the United States, we're talking about also the haves and the have-nots. Jonah, are we doing enough as innovators, as reporters, as advocates for health innovation to bring out the story of racial disparity and health disparities?
No, I don't think we're doing enough, which isn't to say we're not doing anything. We have made a more concerted effort this year, especially to seek out those stories, to diversify the guests at our events and on our podcasts. I've really enjoyed hearing and telling the stories of innovators who are working specifically on those spaces. Companies that are targeting the huge, shameful disparity in maternal mortality rates in the United States is kind of a great example. And then we also on the hospital side, with our HITN publication, one of our major topics is this idea of the social determinants of health and how hospitals can use data and analytics to make sure that they're serving all of their patients, and even being aware of the factors beyond the hospital that are affecting the quality of their patients' care. So I am hopeful that the industry and some of the major leaders in the industry, including my own organization, HIMSS, seem to be taking this really seriously right now. There's a lot of conversation, but there's just so much to be done. I mean, it's a huge problem. And I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the one thing we could do better is to integrate this into all of our coverage rather than just, focus on specific stories and features about it. So when we do write about a new device, think about, how many people actually are going to have access to this, or how is it being made available? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge topic, and I think we've made some progress, and we have a long way to go.
I think it's worthy of asking each of you this question, because I think that, one of the things that comes out from your coverage is not just that you're journalists covering a huge segment of a multi-billion-dollar segment of the economy today, health innovation, digital health. You're also advocates for change. Eric, I think we'll probably all agree we can never do enough. We can never write enough about health disparities. But let me change the question a little bit for you. Of health disparities, one or two high points you think we really need to nail down in the coming months. Make sure that people truly understand, the desperation of people who are facing this lack of access to digital technologies.
Yeah, I think access means a lot of things to a lot of different people. As an example, I live in Maine. Southern Maine is urban. Access to healthcare is much easier here. You go to the other end of the state up north, and you've got one doctor for hundreds and hundreds of miles. You've got winter conditions that make it very difficult to get to the nearest doctor. You've got a lack of broadband connectivity that prevents you from using the internet or using online, using your cell phone even to connect with a doctor. Those are access issues that you're going to find here, you're going to find anywhere. And those are one of the biggest challenges right now to expanding telehealth and providing access to everybody. It's just not one thing. It's a number of different things. And to address that, you've got to address climate, you've got to address geography, you've got to address everything that prevents a person from connecting with a doctor at any given time.
Elise, what do you think? What in terms of this sense of racial disparities and health disparities? We talked a little bit about right now economic disparities. I'm putting you on the spot, not uncomfortably, I hope, but racial disparities. I see this in the community as someone who's been a researcher. Early in my career, we talked about predisposed to heart disease when we were talking about people of color. And I realized they were never predisposed. It's just that they had a lot of heart disease. They didn't have access to good diet. They didn't have access to good medical care. So yeah, they had access to disease. What should we be doing in our reporting about digital health to deal with some of those issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I guess something that I've been analyzing kind of in my own work and just thinking about more broadly in the community in terms of what is shared and how we kind of tell these stories. So I guess some of the things that I think about with digital health are, how is the system developed? Who was involved in making this? If, for example, it was like an AI type of system, I think we've kind of seen some of the different stories about like different types of technology not working well with different skin colors. So have the developers address those types of concerns? Is that something that they've considered? And I guess the one thing that I kind of really wanted, if I wanted to like advocate for anything, would be bringing the people in these communities when we talk about social determinants of health, really having them be involved in developing these solutions or sharing their stories, not just kind of talking generally about the problem and the disparities that we see.
Yeah. You know, Elliot, you talked about the fact that you'll probably be called upon to cover for, you know, the networks, the whole sense of Israel going through its next surge. And you know, what does that mean in terms of, you know, mobilization of people? Can you sort of reflect on, even in the country you're based in right now, you're covering the haves and the have-nots that still exists between the rural and the urban population. You know, you're right now speaking to us from downtown Tel Aviv, one of the most sophisticated stories in the world. Drive 1 hour away from Tel Aviv, you're going to find, you know, sort of a very rural Middle Eastern community. So you can almost throw a stone from place to place and see the differences. How do we reach people? How do we reach people with our reporting to make sure that everybody has equal access to information?
I mean, I think in a country like Israel, when you have, you know, huge levels of penetration, if not everybody having a smartphone, then certainly everybody having internet access pretty much. I mean, I don't think it's really comparable to other markets where, you know, just take, you know, India or other countries, you know, emerging economies where, you know, you do have extremely rural and disconnected communities. So I don't think that's really something that applies here. And of course, it's a very small country. So again, it doesn't have the kind of logistical hurdles that, say, you know, even somewhere like the United States might have with the current vaccine, which of course needs to be with the Pfizer vaccine, for example, which needs to be kept at such low temperatures and, you know, have certain levels of infrastructure in place because, you know, some people are so far away from health facilities. So I think, yes, obviously in Israel there are haves and have-nots. There are you know, racial issues in the same way that there are in other countries, and these are obviously things that need to be addressed. But I think that in terms of health coverage, you know, in terms of the various systems that are in place here, I think that the system is pretty robust. And in terms of information, obviously, in my work, although I do speak reasonable Hebrew, it's certainly not good enough to be on a local network. I wouldn't punish anybody in this country for having to listen to me speaking their language.
Well, we appreciate hearing your reports from Israel to the world. So not to worry about that. No, there's a recent development. Everybody, I saw that when Christina Farr made her announcement last week. I think there must have been a few thousand likes or tweets, and she announced that she was leaving CNN to go into the world of private equity investment. And it's not a big surprise to those of us who've been, I mean, you're doing due diligence every single day about a sector that was once like, isn't that cute? Isn't that cute? To, I think that if I'm not mistaken, there's something like, they report like $800 billion or something like that of total health investment in technology and digital health in the since COVID, $800 billion. And so, you know, we used to like flip to the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Now we're looking at you. We're following you for news on the sector. The Wall Street Journal is doing maybe wrap-up features, and you're hitting the breaking news and having to do the analysis. I wanted to ask each of you a second, not your reaction to Christina Farr. We all wish her great success and happiness, and to you too. That's not the question. But I don't know if our audience really appreciates always the rigor and knowledge that goes into your articles. And that's why I encourage everybody to follow you all on Twitter. It's one of the greatest ways to see your coverage as it's appearing. You do post, or you'll see Elliot on CNN covering from really one of the hotspots of the world in terms of news drivers. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the attributes of your coverage. Rather than sort of my analyze what you're covering, you're not just covering the news. I noticed that there are certain elements that you're trying to bring forth: societal problems, economic challenges, reimbursement issues, behavioral aspects. Could I ask each of you to share with us, just go through your heads a little bit and say, when you decide on a story, what are the layers that you go through to make sure that that's really the story is well reported? And Jonah, could you share with us, because you're not just you're not just taking a press release. That's evident. Once upon a time, people in your space took the press release, you kind of put it into your own words, and boom, it went out. Those days are dead. And I think a lot of people listening in think that that's still going on right now. You're really covering the news. What's the process you go forward as really a HIMSS media editor-in-chief, number of platforms, when you're covering the news? What are the layers of I'm out? And so, Levy, thank you for sharing Twitter handles with people.
The big thing I learned from my mentor, the original founder of mHealth News, Brian Dolan, who, by the way, now runs a paid newsletter product called Exits and Outcomes. And if you're interested in the pharma stuff I was talking about before, cannot recommend it highly enough. One of the things I learned from Brian was that if we're not adding value, we shouldn't be writing the piece. And so what you say about the press release write-up, it's always been part of the DNA at Moby, and I think at the other publications, and I've tried to bring this more to them to the extent that they weren't already doing it, which they obviously were, we are beat reporters with broad, if not deep, expertise. And so every time we write a story, we already have a lot of the context, and then we just have to bring it in by linking to other stories we've written, drawing some connections. We can get even more context, if we have time, and if it's a little bit of a bigger piece, by talking to people who are even smarter than we are, who aren't just journalists, who are experts. And so I think that's our mantra is, are we adding value? Are we adding historical context? Are we adding a broader market snapshot? Are we adding, a prediction or a through line of what led to this and what will this lead to? And I think, we try to make sure that if we're not doing that, if we don't have a reason to write something, if we're not providing anything that you couldn't get from somebody else's story or from the press release, then we're just not going to write it. Why are we doing it? We're not just going to kind of farm for page views and create something redundant that doesn't add value to the ecosystem. So that's the thought process we go through, really. And then the other thing we think about is we're always on the lookout for, is there something in this story that deserves more ink? You've identified this trend in your little what's the trend section at the end of your short news story. Well, that trend could be a whole feature. So let's publish this, and then let's start working on that. So it's always, and then in turn, it's this beautiful cycle, because the next time we write a story, when we're talking about the trend, we can link to that feature and then have the context.
Thank you. Eric, you really are a drill down guy. It's evident. The old sense of investigative reporting almost. What's the process you go through in making a decision and drilling down like that?
That's where I got my start. I was a print reporter for a couple decades before jumping into digital.
Investigative reporter?
Not really. A small town reporter and sports editor and feature writer and managing editor and everything else under the sun for a while. The idea here is that each of us, I think, addresses a slightly different audience, and you have to know what your audience wants to hear. As I said, I focus on providers, the healthcare provider market. So for these stories, I want to answer the questions that they're asking. How does this new technology improve care outcomes for the patients that they're dealing with? How does it improve workflows for these providers? How does it make life, or does it make life easier for them? Is it a worthwhile technology that hospitals, health systems, doctors, so on and so forth are going to use? So those are the questions I'm going to want to ask coming into a specific story. Is it worth writing from the point that my audience will gain value from that story? And then from that, there's some big news issues and stories out there, and I've got to look at it. Does it really affect the people I want it to, or does it really address issues that my audience wants to hear? Is it worth them to read? So I've got to pick and choose and find these little angles out there that appeal to a certain demographic. Sometimes it's a big issue that there's not enough there. There's not enough there to do a story on. Others, there's this issue that can generate several stories out of one topic.
Yeah, Elise, what do you think? I mean, your process, you've taken on sort of a series of stories. It's very, very interesting when I look at some of the work you're doing. It looks like you look for the surprise angle, or sometimes you're comfortable being the contrarian. Everybody's saying, "Isn't this magnificent?" Amazon, medicine, supply chain, eureka! Not only books, now, get your Viagra delivered to your door from Amazon, whatever the case. And you say, "Not so fast." What's your process in terms of looking at a storyline and deciding, like, how are you going to approach it as opposed to everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, not to be like the Grinch saying, "Oh, this doesn't work," but I think every time I see the news,
you can be the Grinch. It's okay. It's that season, right?
It's the season, right? But I guess when some of the news comes out, it's moving quickly, and I think it's easy to get swept up in kind of the excitement of oh, Amazon's getting into pharmacy or big partnerships, that type of thing. But I think it's really helpful for me sometimes to kind of take a deep breath and take a step back and say, okay, what do I know about this? What big questions do I have about how this works? And then normally kind of digging into some of those questions helps kind of reveal things about, whether this is everything it's cracked up to be, or whether there's still some kind of questions that haven't been answered or gaps that kind of need to be filled.
So also a little bit what Eric and Jonah just said, in a way, you're using investigative sort of mindset of like, what isn't going to be covered that you can own uniquely. Now, Elliot, you have a particular challenge because that you put you're your own makeup person right now at CNN. You're handling your studio, you're handling your camera angle, and to some extent the storylines are determined by CNN often. But how do you and your colleagues put your perspective together to cover the story? I mean, obviously you're drawing from the facts, but I think all of us would agree news today is also infotainment, and CNN, has to stay true to the facts, but it also has to stay true to keeping eyeballs on the screen. How do you blend? How do you reconcile the facts with the entertainment element?
Well, I don't think you can ever put set more store on facts than necessary. You can't overstate the importance, and I think that when you're going with the story, and obviously I'm not a spokesperson for CNN, when you're going for a particular story, you're obviously looking to tell the story in as interesting a way as possible. And whether you are a journalist trying to tell that story, or whether you're one of the medtech startups that's watching this broadcast, it's all about storytelling. I was interviewing the CEO of and co-founder of Lemonade recently. I think he's saying like 80 to 90% of a CEO's job is storytelling. And I just want to come back to one other thing that Jonah was saying, and I agree very much that it's all about adding value. But I should also point out that I think that reports of the press release's demise have been somewhat exaggerated. Everyone from a medtech startup to Pfizer will be putting out a press release when they have news to announce. Now, a news organization will probably take its first line from a press release, and you'll have certain ones like Bloomberg, my alma mater, which will have automated programs to kind of take immediately the second a press release comes out or the second news breaks, so that they can try and beat the competition by a few hundredths of a second. But at the same time, there are also journalists who not at illustrious publications such as Jonah Elise's or Eric's, but there are plenty of publications out there who will take press releases and who will pretty much repeat them verbatim, just to kind of generate more content and generate views. And there are also, again, not referring to my colleagues here, but there are lazy journalists out there. And I know for a fact, knowing certain people in PR, and I'm not obviously besmirching PR, because there is a job for PRs to do, and I'm sure that with Fin Partners, you also as an organization put out many press releases for your clients, whether you expect them to be repeated verbatim. But I know, for example, you see these the 10 best startups in, I don't know, medtech in Europe, and or whatever the case may be, and I will notice 70% of the people mentioned are clients of one particular PR firm, and the other 30% are ones that this PR firm would like to have as its clients, because they have a very good relationship with the journalist. The journalist is, not, let's say, not of the same ethical standards as those on our panel and many others out there, and they will literally just put out what it is they want, and because it's all about relationships, and sometimes, and that's what unless I'm mistaken, Gil, that's what a lot of your job is all about relationship building.
We're gonna touch on that. Actually, I'm a contrarian. I'm like Elise. I'm a contrarian of my industry, which I ultimately think, coming into this from the standard, and Levy knows my background as a health provider. I view this very, very differently than most people, which is my responsibility is transcends employer, it transcends client. My responsibility ultimately is to the patient. Am I improving people's care? Am I improving their access to care? And certainly, Elliot, if you check out my background, the word, I guess, that's synonymous with my last name is integrity. Ultimately, as someone who has worked in refugee camps and worked around the world to help people, I see the person in need as my ultimate customer, my ultimate client. And I think people pay me or pay our company because they know we're going to represent a certain level of integrity that cannot be. And you'll also find that our company has resigned millions of dollars of business in the course of a year because we and our respective client are not aligned in terms of what we think truth is. So we may be the anomaly to the industry, but I actually want to deal with the industry for a second in your question, which goes back to, I actually do believe that you are the new conduits to decision making, and you hold great responsibility in the quality of your coverage and the quality of your vetting of information and facts. Just because it's in a press release doesn't mean it's factual. It has to be vetted by the people putting out that release and by the people using that as background. So I wanted to start with Jonah and ask a question, which is really when people approach you, and it could be, as Elliot said, there's a relationship or not a relationship, they're trying to appeal to you with a story idea. What is the next step? What appeals to you and what makes you feel like, pardon my language, this piece of crap? Talk a little bit about that for a few moments. What makes it work, and what makes you feel like you just want to slam we don't slam phones down any longer. We hit stop buttons on our red stop buttons on our phone today. What works for you, Jonah? What doesn't work?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that I think I read a statistic recently that press people outnumber journalists these days 3 to 1. So we get a lot of pitches, and we do a certain amount of triage. And I know it's obnoxious to not respond to a pitch, but the first thing I'll do is if I get a pitch and I think this is not for me, this is not in the space of my publication rights it's about, I'm probably not going to write back and say that. I'm just gonna, click delete, move on to the next pitch, just because it's the time adds up, frankly. But when it comes to like a good pitch, I think again, because of this time thing, you're just like in journalism, your lead is really important. I need the first sentence to tell me what the story is and why I should care about it. Which isn't to say I'm not going to read the rest of the email, but your chances are much better if you just catch my attention. And then I'll forward it to the right editor, or I'll take it up myself if I'm really interested. We really do comprehensive news coverage is an important part of the value that we strive to provide, not just the trends and the analysis. So if a story is, even a little bit big, if it advances the industry, if it's what's the word? An incremental step up of the tech that we haven't seen before, we want to write it. We want to write funding because that sort of positions, how the power players in the industry are. So, we're looking for news, but we also have a pretty good bullshit meter. So if something isn't really news, no matter how big you are, we'll probably want something.
Headline matters. What's the headline? And funding, avoid bullshit. Eric, what's your secret?
Does it promote patient? Does it improve patient outcomes? Does it improve the physician's workload? I get all these pitches too of all these wonderful ideas and concepts and technology. One of the first questions I will ask is there a doctor out there using this technology right now that can tell me about it from a doctor's point of view? I mean, it's great to hear the person who created the technology tell me all about it, but I want to hear someone who's using the technology tell me all about it. Give me that second view.
That's great. Elliot, what makes you decide, let's say for putting the F in tech, what makes you decide? I know that you have access to many executives, but when people are approaching you with ideas for your podcast or for stories, what's the decision-making factor here?
Just, is it an interesting story? There are a number of people that have approached me and said, I've got a great fintech for you to interview for this, and I'll say, well, what's the story? And unless the founder has, it might be a brand new fintech startup, but the founder, is on his seventh or eighth startup, and he's, including quite interesting ones. One of the ones I interviewed, which I haven't published yet, is the chairman of Nutmeg, which is a kind of robo advisor. But previously he was a co-founder of Love Film, which was eventually bought by Amazon, and which was a competitor, and in fact was beating Netflix in its day in the UK and European markets. So he was interesting for that reason. He had some really interesting stories to tell. Someone who's just set up a fintech and hasn't done anything, wouldn't pass the smell test as far as I'm concerned.
So
I'll just say one thing on
track record.
A story, interesting stories to tell. Another one I did recently was a film financing fintech. So he has some really great anecdotes about the film world and about films that he's produced. And the fintech itself is relatively small and new, but he had plenty of really exciting stories. But I would also just add one final thing, which is some journalists will be rude when they are perhaps responding to people or not responding. I always made sure to respond and say thanks, but no thanks. I just think that it's always important to be nice, not because you never know where that person's going to go next, but just because that's just, I think, the best way to be.
All right. Being polite is nice. Elise, as a wrap up, what's your process? People are approaching you all the time. What do to vet out their pitch?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I look for are, I really like it when people share specific information. So instead of saying we have a big client, who is that client? Instead of saying our revenue increased 100%, it increased from this number to this number. Things like that really stand out for me. And I guess the other thing that I think is really important is just being clear and making it, I want to be able to explain what I read about to my mom. So if I'm reading through your press release and it's using a lot of corporate buzzwords and is kind of vague about what your company or what you are trying to achieve, I'm more likely to take a pass on it.
That's great. First, I want to thank the four of you so very much for participating in this. Each of you, Jonah and Eric and Elise and Elliot, you really have contributed to the wealth of knowledge of the people who are participating today. This will also be recorded. It's been recorded. mHealth Israel, Levi Shapiro and his team will be sharing this online. So wealth of information here to dissect, whether it's individual questions or this wrap-up question. I want to thank each of you. I want to thank you for your quality reporting. I follow all of you very, very closely. and actually I use you just as a tip for all our listeners today. I aggregate what's important in the sector by reading your work. And so you actually help me sort of synthesize down very quickly. And that's been very, very key for me. I invite people to do the same. Just by a show of hands, by the way, do you mind if people follow you on Twitter or DM you, or do you prefer not? If you don't mind people DMing you, don't raise your hand. If you invite people to DM you, raise your hand, please. None of you are very okay.
Sorry, that was confusingly worded.
Jonah was thinking, I don't know, but I want to thank you.